You were never supposed to know this, not because it was forgotten, but because it was buried on a fog-drenched ridge in rural Kentucky, tucked between the hollow silence of dying sycamores and the cracked whispers of an abandoned chapel, stood a house no man would approach after dusk. Locals called it Mercy Glen, a name spoken in hushed tones like a prayer that no longer worked. For over 4 decades it housed children no one ever saw again. Dozens arrived, none ever left. No school records, no baptisms, no deaths, just silence. And the townspeople, they looked the other way, because what the Ellingtons offered was something every frightened parent, every broke township, every overburdened orphanage craved: disappearance without guilt. This was 1881, but it might as well have been another world. At the edge of Winchester County, near a rail line defunct since the cholera years, the Ellington estate stood 3 stories tall with windows that reflected no light. A former plantation converted into a so-called child sanctuary, or so the paperwork said. Josiah and Constance Ellington, a reclusive couple with old Southern blood and New England money, had made it their life's mission to take in wayward children from across the South. But there was one rule no agency could explain. None of the children were ever older than 12. Ever. They said it was for moral development, but that wasn't the truth. The truth was deeper, more psychological, more useful, because these children weren't just being adopted, they were being selected. And by the time the Commonwealth tried to audit the home in 1881, it was too late. The rooms were empty, the floors spotless, the ledgers burned, and the woods behind the estate salted and blackened like nothing had ever grown there at all. But here's what they didn't know. Beneath the chapel ruins still rests a stone hatch, unmarquised, heavy, ancient, and what lies beneath it explains why none of the children ever grew up, and why men like Josiah Ellington didn't just want children. They wanted obedience. They wanted raw, shapeable minds. They wanted vessels. And this story is not just about what they did, it's about what they became. The Ellington name carried weight, not just in Kentucky, but in certain sealed circles that didn't answer to the law, didn't answer to the church, didn't answer to anything but legacy and silence. They weren't politicians, not officially, but men with power made quiet trips to Mercy Glen when no one was watching, sometimes arriving with black-coated drivers and nameless briefcases, sometimes leaving with nothing in their hands but less weight on their conscience. This wasn't adoption. This was procurement. The children came from burned-out counties and flood-wrecked towns, from orphan trains derailed by scandal, and from hospitals too overwhelmed to notice who slipped out the back door. No one questioned where they went, because somewhere in the system a form had been stamped, a signature forged, a ledger adjusted by a gloved hand paid well to forget. Josiah Ellington wrote letters with terrifying precision, not emotional, not flowery, just exact, describing each child's skills, temperament, physical health, and what he called spiritual elasticity. That phrase, spiritual elasticity, would show up in 6 separate correspondences linked to men who later served on the boards of correctional asylums, military re-education programs, and at least one defunct federal experiment under the War Department. These weren't school children, they were test subjects. The house itself, Mercy Glen, was designed like no ordinary home, with windows that let light in only during certain hours, mirrors placed at angles that distorted reflections, and rooms below the basement that were never listed on any official blueprint. The deeper you went, the colder it got. Not from lack of heat, but from something older, something below. The survivors, if you can call them that, described a silence underground so thick it crushed thought. One child, Elijah Price, age 9, was documented to have spent 6 consecutive days in a sub-basement chamber known only as Room B12. He came back unable to speak, only drawing spirals on the walls with his fingernails until his hands bled. He wasn't punished. Josiah wrote in his journal that the boy had passed the threshold, that he was now ready for placement. What placement meant? No one dared ask. The next day, Elijah vanished. No record, no witness, just gone. like the others, like all of them. And this was only the beginning. They never kept the children long, 2 years at most, sometimes only months. And yet no child ever appeared older when they vanished. Photographs were forbidden, birthdays never acknowledged, calendars removed from the dormitories, and mirrors veiled in black cloth by the 3rd day of arrival. Time didn't pass at Mercy Glen. It dissolved. Children spoke in whispers, not because they were told to, but because something in that house punished sound. Doors that slammed for no reason, walls that breathed when you were alone, and at night the strange chiming that came from under the floorboards, like bells struck under water. You need to understand this. The Ellingtons didn't see themselves as caretakers. They saw themselves as refiners. Constance Ellington kept a private journal, bound in calfskin and marked with a symbol no child could describe, only draw, a kind of twisted key with an eye at the top. She wrote that children were the only raw material pure enough for transformation. Adults were too fixed, too layered in sin and memory. But a child could be unstitched and rethreaded from the inside out. Their rituals were not of this world, not satanic, not Christian, not even occult in the traditional sense. They were older than language, passed through bloodlines that predated the colonies, whispered from dying tongues of aristocrats who vanished during the burning of Richmond. The rituals involved silence, salt, symbols drawn in iron shavings, and isolation. The first stage was called softening. A child was separated from the others for 7 days. No contact, no sound, no food, but a grey paste that left them weak and easily suggestible. During this stage they were read to, not books, but pages from something handwritten and unbound, always by candlelight, always in a voice that never rose above a murmur. By the 3rd night, most children stopped asking questions. By the 5th, they forgot their own names, and by the 7th, their minds were pliable enough for what came next. This is where obedience became more than just behavior. It became architecture. Their identities were taken apart like wooden toys, piece by piece, shape by shape, until only the shell remained. The shell was ready to be filled. What they filled those children with, no one fully understands, because it wasn't knowledge, and it wasn't faith, and it wasn't anything human minds were meant to hold. It was a presence, not a person, not a spirit, but a frequency, a structure that rearranged the thoughts of the child until their original mind folded inward and vanished. The Ellingtons called it alignment, others called it awakening, but the children who underwent the process were never the same again. Their eyes changed, not in color, but in focus, as if they were seeing something behind your face, something moving behind your words, like they were watching 2 versions of you at once, the one you presented and the one you tried to hide. One surviving worker, a groundskeeper named Fletcher Kane, testified under oath that he once caught a boy standing motionless at the far end of the cornfield before dawn. The child was barefoot, covered in dew, eyes wide open, speaking in a cadence that didn't match the English language. Soft, rhythmic, like reciting a liturgy in reverse, Kane said the words weren't what chilled him. It was the silence that followed, the kind of silence that felt surgical, like a vacuum that removed the part of your brain that knew how to scream. He quit that same night, fled the county, changed his name, and left behind a note no one understood. It said simply, "They are building vessels for what comes after." But not all children made it through. Some minds cracked, others resisted. And for those children the punishment wasn't death, it was removal. Removal meant you were taken below, beneath the chapel ruins, through the stone hatch sealed with 7 iron bolts. You were not brought back. But they didn't call it punishment, they called it recycling. The Ellingtons believed every failure left behind a residue, and that residue could still be harvested. Memory, pain, ear, all of it had a frequency, and frequencies could be refined. They weren't just harvesting obedience, they were distilling suffering, and somehow that suffering powered whatever was waiting beneath the estate, because something was waiting, and it wasn't asleep. There was one room that no one mentioned, Not in the blueprints, not in the journals, not in any official record, but every surviving witness spoke of it with the same tone, like remembering a nightmare they still weren't sure was real. They called it the Red Room, not because of the color, but because of the sound. The walls pulsed with something just under hearing, a slow rhythmic throb like a heartbeat made of static. And the longer you stood inside, the more your own pulse tried to match it. Children taken to the Red Room were always quiet afterward. Not fearful, not traumatized, just emptied. Their speech became mechanical. Their eyes stayed fixed on middle distance, and their drawings, because the Ellingtons encouraged drawing as a form of mental reflection, all turned the same, spirals inside spirals, doors inside heads, children holding hands with shadows that had too many joints and no face. It wasn't art. It was imprinting. They were being used, not just for obedience, not just for rituals, but for something much older and much colder. A repurposing of innocence itself. One drawing survived. Tucked in a hymnal found during the state's final sweep of the grounds in 1882, it showed 20 children standing in a circle around an open pit. Inside the pit, a black obelisk with 7 symbols carved into its base, and a shape above it that looked like a crown made of vertebrae. That hymnal was taken by an unnamed federal investigator. It was never seen again. But the woman who found it, archivist Ruth Calloway, left a single annotation in her journal before vanishing 3 weeks later. She wrote, "The obelisk is not the origin. It is the anchor." Let that sink in. They weren't summoning anything. It was already here. They were holding it, feeding it, refining its food, and the food was pain. Pain shaped by obedience, obedience shaped by ritual, ritual. Performed by children who no longer remembered their own names. Now ask yourself this. Why do you think so many systems today are obsessed with early compliance, early standardization, early intervention? This goes deeper than history. This is architecture. By the summer of 1881, something began to change. Not on the surface, not in reports, but underneath. In the energy, in the patterns, in the way animals refused to go near the property, and clocks stopped working within 50 yards of the estate. Birds flew around the house in wide, unnatural arcs. Dogs refused to bark within earshot. And when it rained, which it rarely did, the water pooled in perfect circles along the roof, unmoving, as if gravity had given up trying. That summer, a boy named Isaac Wren came to Mercy Glen, age 12. One of the oldest ever taken. His paperwork was late, his delivery unannounced, and according to the intake notes, he had no known relatives. But what made him different was not his age, it was his memory. He remembered everything. The others arrived confused, dazed, half-starved, but Isaac arrived calm, alert, and observant. Too observant. Within days, he began mapping the estate in a notebook he kept hidden under a floorboard. Not just the grounds, but the behavior patterns of the staff, the routines of the other children, even the layout of the underground chambers no child was supposed to know about. He asked questions. Dangerous ones. He noticed the Red Room was always unlocked after midnight. He noticed the chapel doors opened wider when no one was near, and he noticed that on the 1st of each month, 7 candles were lit in the root cellar. Even though there were no ceremonies, no prayers, and no guests, Isaac didn't fear the rituals. He studied them, he recorded them. And one night, August 31st, he broke into the basement archive, pried open a drawer sealed with wax, and found something the Ellingtons had buried deeper than anything else. A document older than the house itself, dated 1791, describing the land as a psychogenic gate. Not haunted, but responsive. The soil responded to intention. The structure responded. Dead to suffering, and the children, especially the broken ones, served as amplifiers. This was never just about control, it was about signal strength. The more obedient the mind, the more powerful the echo. Isaac didn't run. He made a plan, a dangerous one, and that plan started with leaving something behind. a phrase meant only for those who would one day awaken like he did. If you're ready to awaken, comment it now. The gate remembers. Say it twice. Lock it in. Isaac knew he couldn't save them all. He was just one boy in a house designed to erase boys like him. But he understood something the Ellingtons never expected. Obedience creates patterns. And once you see the pattern, you can reverse it. So he stopped resisting. He played along. He acted slower, dimmer, more compliant. He bowed his head during the alignment rituals. He stopped asking questions. He began to draw spirals, perfectly shaped, eerily symmetrical. But within them, hidden in the lines, he embedded keys. Not physical keys, conceptual ones. Coordinates, numbers, door counts, shifts in temperature, maps encoded in art, symbols baked into obedience. The Ellingtons praised his progress. They told others that Isaac was the perfect subject. They called him a vessel of clarity. But Isaac wasn't open. He was watching, and by the second month he had discovered the one thing no child was supposed to know. There was a second obelisk, buried deep, deeper than the chapel hatch, deeper than the foundations. It was marked in his journal as O2, surrounded by inscriptions none of the other children could read, but Isaac could, because Isaac had seen those symbols before. In his dreams, before he even arrived, they weren't words. They were commands, not spoken, not written, felt. And one night he followed the frequency, the humming below his bed, the pull behind the wall, the cold draft that seemed to come from beneath the roots of the floor. He descended alone. No candle, no map. Only the notebook pressed to his chest like a shield. And what he found, no human child was ever meant to see, not fire, not blood, not bodies, but machinery, not modern, not mechanical, but biological, ancient, humming with soft pulses like breath from stone. A structure of veins and bone and metal-like roots, wrapped around the obelisk like vines growing backward in time. The air was thick with static that made his teeth ache, and in the center of it all, a single seat shaped for a child, not for worship, for interface. The children weren't sacrifices. They were conduits, living wires, and Isaac, the perfect subject, was meant to sit there next. Isaac didn't sit. He backed away slowly, heartbeat thundering in his ears, eyes locked on the seat carved for someone like him, small, still, silent. He understood now. The rituals weren't meant to please some god. They were instructions, blueprints for building a transmitter made of obedience, fear, and fractured memory. The house was the frame, the children were the wiring, and the thing below, whatever it truly was, it needed a mind that still believed in innocence, a clean signal, a pure channel. Isaac was never meant to survive. He was meant to complete the circuit. But instead of finishing the ritual, he did something no one ever tried. He spoke, out loud, not in prayer, not in submission, but in defiance. He spoke his name, his full name, Isaac Wren, and in that moment the entire chamber shook, not violently, not like an earthquake, but subtly, like a breath being held. He said it again, Isaac Wren. And a crack appeared in the roots of the obelisk, a hairline fracture that ran from the base to the crown, glowing faintly like a dying ember. It screamed, not in sound, but inside his head, a pressure wave of pure rage, pure hunger, like something ancient had been denied its meal. He ran, blind through the tunnels, scraping his legs on stone, blood running down his shin, chased not by footsteps, but by the sound of everything behind him, folding back into silence. When he emerged, the chapel was burning. No one lit it. No one saw who started it, but the flames moved downward, not upward, like fire returning to its origin. And Isaac, barefoot, bleeding, shaking, ran into the forest and was never seen again. No grave, no sightings, no proof, Except for one thing, the journal, recovered 10 years later in a sealed jar, buried at the edge of the Ellington property. Its final page contained only 3 words. They still build. So I ask you again, why do you? You think obedience is rewarded so early in our lives. Why do you think compliance is standardized before memory even forms? Because this didn't stop. It evolved. After the fire, Mercy Glen was declared a structural loss, condemned by county officials who refused to enter the basement, citing unstable ground, though the foundation had never shifted. No bodies were found. No children were listed as missing, because there were no official records to miss. Just ashes, silence, and a name no one dared write down twice. But you don't erase something like that. You relocate it. And 2 years later, a new facility appeared across state lines in Tennessee, registered under a different name. Pine Hollow Development School. Same blueprints, same ratios, same age limits. Never above 12. The names changed, the curtains changed, but the mission didn't. Control the earliest minds, shape the most malleable souls, harness obedience as power. You still think this was an isolated event, a farmhouse horror hidden in Kentucky woods. But look closer. Every generation has its Ellingtons. Every state has its Mercy Glen. It just wears a different face. Military reform academies, behavioral correction homes, rehabilitation centers for troubled youth, all of them wrapped in the language of care, of help, of second chances. But they're not helping. They're programming. Because when you break a child the right way, at the right time, you don't need to control him later. He'll control himself. He'll self-regulate, self-discipline, self-punish. He'll mistake obedience for identity. And when that child grows into a man, he'll build systems just like the one that built him. You know someone like this. Maybe it's you. Maybe there's a part of you that still lowers its voice around authority, that flinches at silence, that avoids looking in mirrors too long because deep down, you're not sure which version of you is staring back. That's not trauma. That's programming. And the people who designed these systems, they weren't trying to destroy children. They were trying to craft precision tools. Silent workers, believers in the machine. Because when you weaponize obedience, you never need a whip. You just give the child a mirror, and he'll do the rest himself. The Ellingtons weren't the first, and they weren't the last. They were simply a visible node, a rupture in a much older network, one that predates paper and law and even language as we know it. This thing, this system, it doesn't have a headquarters. It doesn't wear robes or carry sigils. It wears policies. It wears infrastructure. It wears funding proposals that look harmless on the surface, but carry intentions darker than any dungeon. Mercy Glen was a prototype, not for horror, but for replication. It proved a truth no one wanted spoken, that a child can be used as a frequency device, that pain can be translated into architecture, that obedience can be scaled. Think of the buildings you've walked through, the schools, the training centers, the clinics, all shaped the same. Long corridors, high ceilings, identical rooms, bell systems, fixed schedules. These are not educational designs. They're broadcast chambers, designed to synchronize bodies into rhythm, to erase deviation, to reward sameness. And what do we call the children who resist? Disordered, oppositional, defiant. But defiant to what? To who? To the machine. There's a reason they never want you asking that. There's a reason they medicate the question out of your blood. Because if you trace the blueprint far enough back, it doesn't lead to care. It leads to containment, to modulation, to ritual without the robe. And somewhere inside you, that child still hears the bell, still flinches at the silence, still waits for permission to speak. You don't need to be in Kentucky to be caught in this system. You just need to be alive in it, because they've learned how to expand through programs, through charities, through institutions that speak the language of light, but operate in perfect shadow. You think you're free, but the patterns still run, in your routine, in your restraint, in your refusal to question it. on what you were trained to call good. So I ask you, what is goodness if it was programmed by people who never had your soul in mind? There's a term they never wanted you to hear, behavioral induction threshold. It's not in public textbooks, it's not in child psychology manuals, but it exists, buried in classified research, buried in erased institutions like Mercy Glen. The threshold is the moment a child stops asking why and starts asking what now. It's the moment the self dissolves. The exact second obedience replaces awareness, and if they can reach that point before the age of 12, the changes are permanent, irreversible, not because of trauma, but because of structure. The mind hardwires around the commands, the nervous system sinks to the rhythm of reward and punishment, and the child becomes something else, not just compliant, but transfixed. That's why the Ellingtons chose children so young, not for innocence, but for vulnerability to restructuring. Once the threshold is passed, you don't need chains, you don't need cages, you only need routine. And this is what haunts me most. Not the rituals, not the fire, not the red room, but how familiar it all feels. Because look around you. Look at our systems today. Test scores over curiosity, uniforms over individuality, silence over wonder. We're still building Mercy Glen. We've just digitized the walls. You've felt it. That pull to conform, that fear of speaking the wrong truth, that cold shame that rises when you fail to meet a standard you never chose. That is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. And it was designed, not by monsters, but by men who once sat in chairs shaped just like the one Isaac found, men who grew up not knowing they were grown by it, because that's how deep this goes. The machine doesn't just train obedience, it manufactures architects of it. And if you're not careful, you'll spend your life replicating the very thing that stole your ability to ask why. Ask it now. Why does the system need silence? Why does it need sameness? Why does it start so early? It's not about education. It never was. They always say it's for the child's own good, that the rules are for protection, that the structure builds character, but what kind of character breaks before it bends? What kind of protection requires you to forget yourself? Because here's the truth. The most effective prisons have no bars. They live in routine. They live in compliance. They live in silence. Taught so early, you forget it was ever taught at all. And Mercy Glen perfected it, not by punishing resistance, but by removing the idea that resistance existed. Children weren't told they couldn't speak. They were trained to believe there was nothing worth saying. They weren't forbidden from asking questions. They were shaped to believe every answer already existed. And it came from above. Now look at the world we've inherited. Every institution you trust, from education to mental health to correction, carries the same bones: compliance before cognition, measurement before meaning, survival before self. The architecture never left. It just put on a tie. And the scariest part, the machine doesn't need to hide anymore, because now the broken ones enforce it, the grown children of Mercy Glen, not the literal survivors, but the generational echo. People trained so early in obedience, they become its agents without ever knowing it. Teachers who shame curiosity, bosses who reward silence, parents who punish nonconformity in the name of tradition. They were programmed too, and the machine keeps running because its most faithful servants have no idea they're even inside it. That's how you scale a system. That's how you birth control through love. You hollow out a generation, fill them with fear dressed as structure, and watch them pass it on with a smile. So when you ask how this happened, when you wonder why so many people walk through life asleep, obedient, angry at the wrong things, silent in the face of reared power, remember Mercy Glen, remember Isaac, remember that chair carved for the obedient mind, because if you're not careful, you're already in it. There's a myth they whispered around the orphan circuits, long before the Ellingtons, long before the archives were burned, A phrase scrawled into the underside of train cars and shelter bunks, passed from mouth to mouth by kids who didn't know its meaning, only that it followed the silence. The phrase was simple. The watchers need clean hands. It sounds like nonsense. Until you understand the system doesn't just extract obedience, it erases origin, because obedience alone is not enough. The machine wants disconnection from self, from ancestry, from memory. Because a child without history is a vessel without friction, and a vessel without friction becomes a perfect transmitter. Think about it. Why are so many systems designed to isolate, to separate the child from his roots, from his instincts, from his wildness? They call it discipline. They call it growth. But what if it's pruning, cutting away the parts that remember, the parts that fight, the parts that speak the name of pain without apology, because those parts are inconvenient to control. That's why the first step was always identity removal. At Mercy Glen, the children were given new names, simpler ones, easier to say, easier to file, easier to forget. Isaac was the first to write his own name in blood, not for drama, for defiance. Because in that system, remembering who you are is an act of war. The Watchers, whatever they are. Whatever intelligence resides beneath the chapel floor and within the silent obelisks, they don't need slaves. They need carriers, obedient minds trained to house command without resistance. Human routers, capable of transmitting old intentions through new skin. That's what alignment meant, not control. Convergence, a merging of systems, organic and otherwise. And those who reached perfect alignment were never seen again. Because they didn't die, they transformed, and the system continued. Always searching, always building, always watching. In 1904, a retired railroad inspector named Malcolm Baird wrote a letter to a friend in Louisville. It was never mailed. The letter was found in a sealed tobacco tin hidden beneath the floorboards of his cabin nearly 70 years later. Its contents were simple. A single page, shaky handwriting, and one diagram drawn in charcoal. The letter read, "I walked past it, but it was already inside me." And below that, a crude sketch of the Mercy Glen estate. But it wasn't labeled Mercy Glen. It was titled Node 3. That's what changed everything, because that name only shows up in one place. An internal document from the War Department dated 1921, classified, later leaked in fragments through a forgotten FOIA request. Node 3, Behavioral Conditioning and Psychogenic Signal Experimentation, terminated due to containment breach, location redacted, subjects unrecovered, program replicated. Now ask yourself, what kind of breach makes them replicate the system instead of destroy it? Unless replication was always the goal, not a failure, a migration. Because what the Ellingtons began wasn't meant to stay local, it was a prototype for distributed influence. Train a child in one place, activate him in another, create perfect receivers who don't even know they've been tuned. And when they grow up, you activate the signal, a phrase, a sound, a symbol, a trauma, something small, but perfectly tailored to the architecture of obedience carved into them when they still thought monsters only lived under beds. That's the true function of the old houses, the orphan farms, the reform estates. They weren't places of punishment. They were black sites for psychological inscription. And now, the world is full of people who have no idea a signal is even possible because they've been prepared for it since they were too young to form resistance. Think about that. Not just the horror, but the scale. And ask yourself, if there was a Node 3, where are Nodes 1 and 2? Node 1 was never on this continent. That's the part nobody wants to admit, because it wasn't built by Americans. It was studied by them. Long before Mercy Glen, long before Massachusetts, there was a monastery in eastern Prussia, hidden beneath a stone fortress that was supposedly leveled in 1812. Only it wasn't. Local peasants still refused to go near the ruins, not out of superstition, but memory. Because their grandparents remembered the bells. They remembered the children who walked in pairs, always pairs, never speaking, always watching. and once a month they said the sky above the monastery turned black. No storm, no clouds, just black. Node 1 was not a building. It was a living diagram, a geometric arrangement of cells, stairwells, and chambers, designed to shift the psyche through repeated motion. Children were made to walk the pattern daily, at sunrise and again before dusk, barefoot, head down, 7 circuits each time. If they cried, the bells rang louder. If they stopped walking, the lights went out. Not electric lights, something else. The glow came from seams in the stone, pale blue, pulse-like. And this pattern, this movement, it trained something into them, or maybe out of them, because after 49 days, the children stopped reacting to pain, stopped responding to names, stopped dreaming. This was called the quieting. And it wasn't just psychological, it was energetic. The walls of Node 1 were built from a kind of black limestone mixed with magnetite and crushed antlers. Materials used in older rituals meant to thin the veil. These weren't experiments. They were rituals disguised as science. Or maybe science was the disguise, because the goal was never to fix the children. It was to fracture them in a way that made them resonate. And in that resonance, something came through, something without form, something that needed shape. That's what the nodes were for, to build the architecture necessary for its arrival. Node 2 was American, built in 1856, but buried in records as a mineralogical survey site in the Colorado Territory, except no minerals were ever extracted, and no survey was ever completed. What was completed was a chamber, hexagonal, cut into the base of a mountain with tools no one could identify. Even in later years when the army tried to replicate the design, it was called Hollow 12. No light source, no doors, just a tunnel that ended in silence, and one word carved above the entry arch: reversal. The few who entered reported disorientation, time distortion, auditory hallucinations, and in some cases, the inability to recognize their own reflection afterward. But the project continued, because this was not a failure. It was progress, you see. Node 2 wasn't built to house children. It was built to store what was left of them: echoes, imprints, cognitive residue from experiments in the East, memory trapped in geometry, emotion baked into space. They were trying to capture obedience, like a photograph, to compress suffering into structure and to use that structure as a beacon. So, when the Ellingtons began their work in Kentucky, they weren't innovators, they were implementers, agents of a design much older than them, a design tested in Europe, refined in the mountains, and activated in the bodies of children who never got to write their real names down. And here's the part that should make your blood freeze. Node 2 is still active, sealed off, yes, restricted by government decree, yes, but not destroyed. And inside it, Hollow 12 still pulses, once a year, for 7 nights. The air above that mountain changes. Bird migrations shift, animal behavior distorts, and if you stand near the base with no electronics, you can hear something faint. A rhythm, the kind that doesn't just enter your ears, it sinks your breath. And if you're not strong, it changes your thoughts. That's what the nodes were always for. Not to kill the soul, but to reroute it. Most people think control comes from outside, that someone with more power exerts it over someone with less. But real control, the kind that lasts, is internalized. It becomes indistinguishable from self. That's the final step of the system, to make you believe it was your idea to stay small, to stay silent, to follow rules you never wrote. And that's what the Ellingtons mastered. They weren't torturers. They were architects, crafting lives so predictable, so rhythmically engineered that even the desire for rebellion was removed, because if you break someone loudly, they remember, but if you rewire them quietly, they never know. That's the horror of what happened to those children. Not just the beatings, not just the malnourishment, but the way their minds were edited, like paragraphs cut from a book that no longer makes sense, and no one notices until it's too late. Obedience isn't the goal. Obedience is the medium, the canvas they use to paint something older into these children. A signal, a frequency, a shape meant for housing something that doesn't live in blood, but needs blood to enter. Why do you think every ancient system had rites of passage before puberty? Why do you think every old civilization had initiations at 12 or 13? Because that window of time is sacred, the last moment a soul can be shaped without question. And that's where the machine works best. Right before the questions begin, it paints the fear directly into the blueprint of self, and we call it discipline. We call it growing up. We call it being good. But good by whose design? By what standard? Because the systems that produced Mercy Glen are still alive. In the way schools reward silence over honesty. In the way jobs celebrate loyalty over truth. In the way entire societies teach men to shrink their voice and call it maturity. It starts early. So early you don't even know it. Happened. Until one day you wake up and realize the thoughts in your head don't belong to you. They were placed there, carefully, efficiently, lovingly. By the time Isaac Wren ran from the burning chapel, the system had already accounted for him. He thought escape was freedom. But the machine doesn't care if you flee. It cares if you forget. And that's what it bet on, that the noise of the world would drown out the signal, that he'd grow old and quiet and disbelieving, that eventually he'd doubt his own memory. Or worse, reinterpret it as childhood fantasy. But Isaac never forgot. He didn't just escape. He scattered, not his body, his knowledge. He hid pieces of the pattern in every place that would never be taken seriously. Graffiti under train bridges, margin notes in discarded hymnals, coordinates hidden in folk songs no one sings anymore. He made his own node, not for control but for awakening. And now, decades later, we're finding them. Not all, but enough to see the shape, because Isaac understood what the machine feared most. Memory. True memory. Not nostalgia, not childhood fragments softened by time, but cellular memory. The kind of knowing that rises without language, that hits your spine before your mind can name it. That's why they attack it so early, why they flood your brain with distraction and call it opportunity. Because if you remember you stop obeying. And if you stop obeying, you stop transmitting. And if the transmission fails, the signal dies. The system isn't omnipotent, it's parasitic. It needs belief. It feeds on unconscious repetition. So what happens when enough people stop repeating? When enough men look at the machine and say no, not with rebellion, but with clarity. That's the war, not against armies, but against the invisible ritual of forgetting. So ask yourself, when did you last choose your thoughts? When did you last trace your beliefs back to the moment they were planted, because that's where your signal begins and that's where their system ends? This is the moment in the story where most people turn back, where the truth starts to feel too large, too real, too close. But you're still here, so now I'll give you what they never wanted you to hear spoken aloud. The children at Mercy Glen weren't just altered. They weren't just broken. They were linked. Not by blood, not by language, by geometry. Because the estate itself, when mapped from above, forms a shape older than English, older than Christ, older than time, as we define it. 13 points, 14 corridors, one axis, a symbol buried in Kabbalistic texts and forbidden grimoires, a shape designed not to be seen, but to be walked. The property was a sigil, and every child who lived there activated it by moving through the rituals day after day after day. And when enough of them were aligned, when enough minds had been silenced, the door opened. Not a literal door, but a vibrational one that allowed them in. Not ghosts, not aliens, not demons in the way Hollywood would sell you, but something worse, something hungry for order, something that feeds on structure. And what better source than a child who no longer resists, because that's the real product. Not obedience, vacancy. That's why the Ellingtons took in so many. That's why none of them ever grew older, because growing up means remembering, it means resisting, it means questioning the structure, and they couldn't allow that. So they kept the children right where the machine needed them, suspended in time, trapped inside a pattern designed to strip the soul until only form remained. And here's where you come in, because now you know. Now the structure can't remain hidden. So if you're hearing this, you were never meant to be just a viewer. You were meant to be a witness. And if you're ready to burn the blueprint, say this phrase in the comments twice. I will not carry their shape. Say it twice. To break the rhythm, say it twice. To reclaim the pattern, say it twice. To make the machine notice. If you said the phrase, even once in your mind, the machine felt it. Because what they built at Mercy Glen was not confined to land, it was a framework for consciousness. And every time that phrase is spoken with intention, it creates static in the signal. Small at first, barely noticeable, but like cracks in stained glass. It spreads. Because the human mind was never meant to be molded into symmetry. It was meant to wander, to rebel, to fracture toward freedom. That's why they fear memory. That's why they fear the ones who question what feels off. Not just in the world, but in themselves. Because the most dangerous rebellion is not loud, it's subtle clarity. It's a man waking up and saying, that thought doesn't belong to me. That rule was never mine, that silence isn't peace, it's programming. And that's when their grip begins to slip. Not all at once, but moment by moment, decision by decision. You were never meant to live inside their rhythm. You were meant to hear the false music and choose your own note. But here's the catch. They've already prepared for this. The system evolves. It doesn't fight you with chains anymore. It offers incentives, likes, follows, titles, comfort, and it will speak in the voice of safety. While slowly shaving down your awareness, that's how it survives, not by destroying you, by domesticating you, by teaching you to fear the rawness of your own mind. So let this next truth hit you hard. If they can train you to shrink, they can sell you the feeling of growth, and you'll never know the difference. Unless you walk back into the ruins of your own story. Unless you confront the parts of you that agreed to be smaller. That's what Isaac did. That's what this story has always been about. A boy who saw the blueprint early and chose to break it. Now you stand where he once stood, and what you do next will echo louder than you think. There's something the records never explained. Why none of the children at Mercy Glen were ever found. Not even in the ashes. Not a bone, not a tooth, not a trace. The fire consumed everything, but left no bodies. How does that happen? It doesn't. Not under natural law, but it does under the system they built. Because when the alignment was complete, when the obedience was absolute, the children didn't die. They crossed, not to heaven, not to hell, but to a place the Ellingtons called the Fold. They wrote about it once, in a hidden journal found inside a rusted stove 2 miles from the chapel. The ink had faded, but one phrase was still legible. They are with the shape now, and the shape remembers them. And that's when it all clicked. They weren't harvesting bodies, they were harvesting architecture. They were using children to construct a living bridge, a frequency gate built not of matter, but mind. Each child became a piece of the sigil, a note in the chord, a layer of the resonance, and once the gate was complete, the form on the other side entered, not into our world, but into us, into our systems, our cultures, our calendars, our schooling, our thoughts. That's why nothing ever felt quite right again. That's why men wake up with hollow ambition. That's why you scroll for hours and still feel starved, because something got in, something that feeds on disconnection. And it doesn't want your death. It wants your identity. It wants to erase the wild geometry of your soul and replace it with a grid, a neat little box, predictable, profitable, controllable. But here's the thing they didn't calculate. The shape remembers. Yes, but so do we. Deep in the bones, beneath the obedience, beneath the fear, the memory is there, waiting to burn, And once enough of us remember, the gate closes, the resonance breaks, and what they summoned will have no host left to cling to. So ask yourself, are you still hosting their shape? Somewhere in Kentucky, beneath soil that's never been plowed, there's a vault. It's not marked on any map, no sign, no fence, no warning, just a patch of land where birds don't fly overhead and compasses spin in slow circles. Locals call it Devil's Acre, but that's not its real name. Its real name was Chamber Zero. Isaac Wren mentioned it only once, in a letter written in his 70s to a man named Virgil Kessler, an archivist who died under unusual circumstances 5 days after receiving it. The letter simply said, "The chapel was never the core, it was the antenna." The vault is still humming. And this is where everything turns, because if the chapel was the antenna, then Mercy Glen wasn't the source. It was the transmitter. And Chamber Zero, that's the origin, a chamber built not by the Ellingtons, not even by their predecessors, but by something older, buried so far back that even the land forgot, constructed before the state existed, before Kentucky was even a name. Some say it was carved by the mound builders, others say it predates the human hand entirely. But here's what we know. Its geometry matches ancient temples found in Sumer, in Carthage, in ruined portions of Malta that have no known builders, and in every site the same 3 features appear: a tri-lobed arch, a spiral chamber descending clockwise, and a central basin that is always, always dry. What was meant to fill it, what was drained from it, we don't know. But the ritual was never just about control. It was about invitation. Because the shape that the Ellingtons helped activate didn't come from them. It came through them, and it only needed one thing to cross: an empty vessel. That's what the children were trained to become. Not laborers, not students, but vessels, polished through routine, emptied through obedience, hollowed through isolation. So when the fold opened, it had somewhere here to go. And if Chamber Zero is still humming, then maybe, just maybe, the invitation is still live. You ever wonder why certain places make your skin crawl even when nothing happens there? Why certain fields feel too quiet? Why a particular hallway seems to breathe when you're alone? It's not superstition, it's memory. Not yours, the land's. Because trauma isn't just stored in bodies, it's stored in space. And when the rituals are strong enough, the land becomes a participant. It starts to remember the shape. And if the shape is repeated long enough, it starts to want it. That's what Chamber Zero did. It taught the earth to echo. So even after the Ellingtons were gone, even after the chapel burned, even after the Commonwealth buried the files and redacted the maps, the land kept whispering. That's why hikers still go missing along County Road 7. Why no crops grow within half a mile of the western tree line. Why every photograph taken near the old site has one corner distorted. Always the same corner, because the fold doesn't close on its own, it needs to be unwritten. And you don't do that with fire. You do it with memory. You do it by pulling the pattern out of secrecy and laying it bare in daylight, by saying the names they erased, by speaking the truths they buried beneath 10,000 layers of polite history. So let's say their names: Timothy Caldwell, Sarah Brennan, Elias Gray, Martha Keene, Lemuel Stone, and the dozens more who never reached adulthood because someone decided their silence was more profitable than their voices. We name them not for mourning, but for rupture, because every time you speak what was forbidden, you fracture the ritual. Every time you remember what was hidden, you interfere with the signal. And when enough people do it, the fold doesn't just weaken, it shatters. You think it's just a story. But stories are architecture, and the ones you believe shape the world you walk through. So if this story shook you, it's because it touched a part of you that remembers. And if you keep listening, that part will start to wake up. There's something you need to understand now. This isn't just about Mercy Glen. It's not just one farm or one family or even one generation of harm. This is infrastructure. You don't build a system like this unless you plan to scale it. And they did, because what the Ellingtons started in 1881 didn't end in Kentucky. It became a blueprint for quiet domination, ritualized, sanitized, modernized, and hidden beneath the banners of reform and care. Boys' homes in Missouri that burned their intake logs. Sanatoriums in West Virginia where no exit records exist. Private academies in New Hampshire that required silence during meals and had doors that only locked from the outside. Every one of them followed the same rhythm. Isolate, obey, forget, and then transmit. Because that's the pattern that feeds the shape, and today it's evolved. It doesn't need farms anymore. It uses screens. It uses policies. It uses metrics and diagnostics and identity labels so polished you forget they came from the same machinery that once chained a boy to a post for speaking out of turn. It uses progress as its mask. And if you think this is exaggeration, ask yourself this: why are modern institutions obsessed with compliance disguised as self-improvement? Why do so many programs reward silence? Why is dissent treated as pathology? Because the system doesn't care how you dress it, as long as the shape remains. It's not just the children they want now, it's the man who never grew out of the obedience, the one who still hears a whistle and straightens his spine, the one who still asks permission before remembering what he already knows. That's the man the system loves most, because he becomes a transmitter for others, unaware, unquestioning, unbroken. On the outside, but hollow inside, until he decides to look, to speak, to shatter. You feel that weight in your chest right now. That's not fear, that's recognition. And once you recognize the cage, you can never unknow it. Let me ask you something. Most men were trained never to answer. When did they first teach you to ignore your instincts, not your impulses? Your instincts, the voice in your gut that flinched when something felt wrong, the part of you that hesitated when the world demanded you act normal in the presence of darkness, because that's where they began. Not with chains, but with shame. They taught you to override your knowing, to trade awareness for approval, and every time you did it, the signal got stronger, the shape got sharper, the fold grew deeper, until the world no longer needed locks, because you became your own warden. Think about it. Who taught you to dismiss your fear as weakness? Who taught you to smother your rage instead of directing it at the source? Who taught you to laugh when your soul wanted to weep? The system did. Not through violence, through repetition. Repetition of false narratives, of hollow archetypes, of hollow manhood that looked strong but served obedience. You think this ends with the Ellingtons. You think the fold only existed on that cursed Kentucky land. Look around. Look at the cubicles, the standardized tests, the men who've never shouted their real name because they forgot they had one. That's not life. That's architecture. And you were built into it. But there's another kind of structure, one made of memory, of names spoken aloud, of stories once buried now weaponized as truth. That's what this is. Not content, not entertainment. This is a counter-signal. And you heard it for a reason, because some part of you is still intact, still wild, still unwritten by their hand. You wouldn't be listening otherwise. So here's your choice. Go back to sleep. Scroll to the next distraction. Let the rhythm smooth over what you just felt. Or pick up the thread. Keep pulling. Keep naming. Keep fracturing the lie with every remembered truth. Because when enough men do that, the shape collapses, and the fold loses its anchor. Let's burn it then. Let's tear out every root they thought you'd never find, because it's not just about history. It's about pattern inheritance. And patterns can be broken, but only when seen clearly, so look closer. What was the real lesson at Mercy Glen? That children are expendable? No. That obedience is salvation? No. The real lesson was this: control hides in care. The more they spoke of love, the more brutal the structure became, the more they emphasized duty. the more they erased identity, and the more they wrapped their rituals in morality, the harder it became to resist without guilt. That's the brilliance of the system. It doesn't break you with force, it breaks you with language. They call it discipline, but it's deletion. They call it protection, but it's programming. They call it love, but it's loyalty to the shape. And when you understand that, really understand it, the whole map turns inside out, because you start seeing it everywhere, in how schools suppress the gifted but uncooperative, in how families reward silence over honesty, in how systems elevate predictability and punish vision. They don't want men who see, they want men who mirror, reflect the structure, echo the signal, transmit the fold. But here's where it ends. When a man stops echoing, when he starts naming, when he starts remembering, that's when the false grid begins to crack. And once cracked, it can never be perfect again. And that imperfection, that jagged edge of clarity, that's how the other side leaks out. The side they tried to erase. The side that knows the truth, that this life was never meant to be lived under someone else's pattern. You weren't made to be a shape. You were made to be a force. And forces can't be filed, graded, owned. They move, they change, they break structure. Just like you're doing right now. The shape is dying, but it won't go quietly. It will scream through your screens. It will whisper through algorithms. It will offer you comfort in exchange for your edge. That's its last defense. Pleasure as sedation, dopamine as obedience, convenience as a collar. Because once you stop fearing them, once you stop repeating their rhythm, they can't reach you directly. They can only offer masks, masks of success, masks of status, masks of self-love that ask you to amputate the very part of you that sees the lie. But you're past that now. You've seen too much, heard too much, remembered too much. You've seen what they did to those children. You've seen what they built under the guise of goodness. You've seen how that blueprint still echoes in the lives of men who think their exhaustion is a personal failure, not a designed outcome. And you've seen how fast the shape begins to tremble when one man stops obeying and starts speaking. Because memory is not passive, it's combustive. It doesn't just recall, it reclaims. And that's what you're doing here. Not watching, reclaiming, not consuming, contaminating their signal with clarity, because you're not supposed to hear this. You're not supposed to feel this, but now you do. And that's a door they can't close. Because now you're dangerous. Not because of violence, but because of vision. Because you know that everything they built, everything they called necessary, was a lie to protect the structure. And now the structure is collapsing from within, because one man remembered, then 10, then 1,000, and now you. So carry this forward, not like a story, like a weapon, because they still exist, not as people, as patterns, and patterns only die when you stop dancing to them. This is the final breach, the last chamber, and if you've made it this far, it means the shape didn't hold you. You slipped through the cracks, you remembered. So here's the last truth they buried beneath Mercy Glen. It was never about the children, it was about you. Because the blueprint they carved into those kids, the rituals, the isolation, the obedience by design, it wasn't meant to end with them. It was meant to become a template, to pass from body to body, generation to generation, until it reached you. And by the time it did, they thought it would be unrecognizable. A career path, a belief system, a quiet life with no questions and even less memory. But something broke. Not in you, around you. Because the signal has been failing, you can feel it. In the unease behind the news cycle, in the eyes of men who wear suits but carry dead voices, in the way the world feels less like a home and more like a set. They know it's crumbling. They know the structure can't hold if men remember what it means to walk unscripted, to speak without permission, to feel rage and not turn it inward, to see corruption and not call it success. That's what this was always about. Not horror for horror's sake, not history for entertainment, This was an awakening protocol, and now you're in it. No more hiding, no more forgetting. You've been reactivated. So what now? You name what you see, you speak what they silence. You disrupt the rhythm every time it asks you to shrink, because the fold can only survive in men who refuse to look inward. But you just did. So now you are the breach, the memory they tried to erase, the architecture they never accounted for. And when they scan the system for obedience, all they'll find is static. This message is concluded, but the work has only begun. You know what to do now? So do it without their shape, do it twice, and never stop moving through the cracks you were born to break.